Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon and a very warm welcome to this webinar on GDPR for musicians delivered by the ISM Trust. My name is John Robinson and I'm one of the legal advisors here at the ISM. It's Wednesday the 25th of July and this will probably take about an hour, including some questions. Before we begin, just a few technical points. You can't see me, but you should be able to see the PowerPoint presentation. You should also be able to hear me, but I can't hear you. So if you have any questions, please type them in the questions box and I'll answer as many as possible at the end of this presentation. This webinar is being recorded and will be available to view on the ISM's website at ism.org/webinars. For those of you who maybe don't know us, the Incorporated Society of Musicians, or the ISM, was established in 1882 to promote the art of music and to support professional musicians. Now, 135 years later, we support a membership of more than 8,000 music professionals of all kinds, teachers, performers, composers, and many more besides, with legal advice and representation, tax and business advice, and award-winning professional development opportunities, along with campaigning and advocacy for the music sector as a whole. Through our sister charity, the ISM Trust, we've established a means to share our experience and expertise with musicians, beyond just those who are ISM members, and this webinar is part of the Trust professional development opportunities open to all musicians. I hope you'll find the information helpful, and it will be available on our website shortly after this webinar. By the end of this webinar, I hope you'll have a clear picture of what the GDPR is all about, how it may apply to you, and what to do next if you've yet to start on your GDPR journey. We will look at the legislation and some essentials, and the key definitions and what they mean. We'll also look at the 7 data protection principles which underpin the legislation. That's everything you need to do, which is informed by these principles. And they all go back to the central point of the law, which is about making sure personal data about individuals is handled fairly, transparently and responsibly by those collecting and using it, and that those people are accountable for their decisions and actions in relation to other people's data. This is complemented with legal rights to individuals to access information that others may hold on them, to get it changed if it's inaccurate, and to have it deleted in certain circumstances. To process people's personal data, you need to have a lawful basis for doing so. We'll take a look at the 6 lawful bases in the new legislation. I think it's worth noting now that you only need 1 for each type of processing that you do, not all 6. A key word within GDPR and data protection is purposes. What are you doing and can you justify it? Is the processing of personal data necessary? Bear this in mind as GDPR is underpinned by this idea that you must have a clear purpose for collecting someone's data, and it needs to be a lawful purpose. You must tell people what your purpose is. Related to this is the idea that you can't collect data for one purpose and use it for another if you haven't told people what the other purpose is. Also worth noting, GDPR means that data controllers have to make these decisions and justify them. We'll come to this in more detail later. We will then look at some practical measures you need to take if you haven't already started, looking at auditing what data you collect, how you may collect and use the data, what your lawful basis might be, and how you need to document all this. We also look at what you need to tell people about what you're doing with their data and what you need to put in a privacy statement. We will also take a closer look at the individual's rights here. Anyone who has an email account will have been swamped with messages in recent months from companies and services you may or may not have signed up to, asking for your consent or seeking to renew it to carry on sending you emails. Email marketing is worth a closer look because it's determined by existing electronic communications and privacy law as well as by GDPR. The Information Commissioner's Office, always referred to as the ICO, is the UK regulator for data protection, and it's a great source for further information and advice. You may also need to pay a fee as a data controller. Finally, we look briefly at next steps and what you can do to get underway with your GDPR journey. Essentials 1, the law. The UK revised its data protection laws to comply with the General Data Protection Regulation, that is of course GDPR, which is a European Union regulation that came into force on the 25th of May this year. By the way, Brexit does not affect the need to comply with GDPR, as the UK has replaced our old Data Protection Act 1998 with new domestic legislation that enshrines the provisions of GDPR. This is the new Data Protection Act 2018. So what are the changes? GDPR builds on current data protection law, but introduces some significant new changes affecting the way businesses, including sole traders such as music teachers, individual performers or partnerships, must handle personal data about individuals. There's rights for individuals. GDPR gives individuals, who we call data subjects in the legislation, greater control and enhanced rights in respect of their personal data and how it is used or processed, as it says in the law, by data controllers. That's to say, the organisations or businesses, including sole traders and partnerships, which use individuals' personal data. There are responsibilities for the data controllers corresponding to the rights to ensure that you're transparent about what data you hold on any individual, what it's used for, who you share it with, and how long you keep it for. All this means that you need to understand the following. So get to grips with the underlying principles of data protection and put them into practice. Understand your own data and document it. Identify a lawful basis or bases, there are 6 in the legislation, which we'll discuss further in this presentation, for processing your personal data. And you also need to communicate transparently and openly about what data you hold and why. You need to be accountable. This means documenting what you do with the data so you can show accountability and demonstrate your compliance with the new laws. This is an important strand, so documentation is a key part of compliance with GDPR. A quick look at terminology. There are a few important definitions that will help you to determine whether the rules apply to you, so it's important that you understand them. Personal data means data about a living person who can be identified from the data you hold on them. This can include names, addresses, that includes email, IP addresses and other online identifiers, telephone numbers, birth dates, academic records, health information, other materials such as photographs or videos, and so on. A data subject is a natural identified or identifiable living person whose personal data is processed by a controller or processor. A data controller is someone who decides what and how any such data is processed. So if you collect any of the data elements above and use them to issue invoices, send contracts, send marketing email, you're likely to be a data controller. A data processor is someone who processes personal data on your behalf. For example, a direct debit firm handles your customers' regular payments, a payroll company if you have employees and outsource your pay routines, and so on. You are still responsible for any data you share with another party, such as a data controller. If you send personal data to your accountant, the accountant is your data processor. Please note that where you use a data processor, you must have a written contract in place which includes specific terms which deal with data protection. Where this applies to you, I recommend reading the ICO guidance on what needs to be in the contract. Processing is defined widely and includes almost anything you could do with the data. Obtaining it, recording it, holding it, organizing it, adapting it, altering it, retrieving, consulting, disclosing, combining, deleting or destroying it. Stricter rules apply to certain other categories of data. It's called special categories, and that's previously referred to as sensitive personal data. And this includes information about racial or ethnic origins, political opinions, religious beliefs or philosophical beliefs, union membership, health and sex life and sexual orientation. If you process these special categories, you need to take extra care of them, and that's explained in the legislation and in the ICO's guidance on all of this. So just to summarise, by way of an example, you are a data controller and must comply with the law if you process the personal data of living individuals electronically or in a manual filing system. So a private teacher that retains the personal details, e.g. names, addresses, emails, bank details, of parents and the pupils for recording and accounting and invoicing purposes, that's a data controller. Performers who keep records of their clients' details, that's a data controller. Choir leaders that retain the personal details of choir members, you're a data controller. So the next question is, well, what does this require you to do? And there are three key things that you need to do. First one is comply with data protection principles, of which there are 7, which we'll talk about in a moment. Make sure that you give your data subjects their individual rights. We'll talk about those too. And if you're required to do so, you need to notify the Information Commissioner that you are a data controller. I'll tell you later on how to go about ascertaining whether you do need to do this, so don't worry about that for now. We'll come on to that shortly. Okay, the data protection principles within GDPR, here they are, the 7 of them. Data controllers must comply with all of these when processing personal data, and I'm going to talk to you about each one, so we'll be on the slide for a while. But before that, I just wanted to quote the ICO's own comment on these principles, as it conveys exactly the flavour of GDPR, and the fact that it is you, as a data controller, who will need to assess the data you hold, and you who will need to make decisions about what you do and how you justify it. The ICO says, the principles, the data protection principles, lie at the heart of the GDPR. They are set out right at the start of the legislation and inform everything that follows. They don't give hard and fast rules, but rather embody the spirit of the general data protection regime. Compliance with the spirit of these key principles is therefore a fundamental building block for good data protection practice. It is also key to your compliance with the detailed provisions of the GDPR. Thank you, ICO. Now, while this language may appear somewhat irresolute, it's characteristic of the turn of mind GDPR requires us to adopt. It leaves a lot of room for personal judgment. For example, you can decide for yourself the lawful basis on which you process personal data, among other things, provided you have a justification for your decisions, which you should also put in writing as evidence that you are complying with your transparency and accountability obligations. If your justifications are reasonable, you are likely to be able to defend yourself if ever you are challenged. Back to the principles. Number 1, this requires that personal data must be processed lawfully, fairly, and in a transparent manner. This is really important, and we will examine some of the practical implications in more detail. But for now, a quick summary, again from the IPO's current guidance on the meaning of lawful, fair, and transparent. This means you must identify valid grounds under the GDPR, known as a lawful basis, for collecting and using personal data. You must ensure that you do not do anything with the data in breach of any other laws. You must only use personal data in a way that is fair. This means you must not process the data in a way that is unduly detrimental, unexpected, or misleading to the individuals concerned. You must be clear, open and honest with people from the start about how you will use their personal data. So in practical terms, there are 2 main facets to this first principle, namely, number 1, fairness and transparency. This requires you to communicate privacy information in a privacy policy or notice. Individuals should be provided with certain information, and this must be provided at the time their personal data are obtained. So put this into your privacy statement. You may also come across the terms privacy policy, fair processing notice. They all mean the same. The GDPR sets out the information you should supply in your policy or notice, and we'll look at this in more detail a little further on. Number 2 of our facets, lawfulness. This requires you to identify your legal basis for processing data and set this out in your privacy statement or notice. We discuss this in more detail in a moment. Turning to the other principles, number 2, this is also known as purpose limitation. Personal data must be collected only for specified, explicit and lawful purposes and not for any incompatible purposes. That is to say, only process personal data for the purposes you communicated in your privacy information. If your purposes change, you must update your privacy policy and notify individuals of these changes. Number 3, also known as data minimization, only collect what you need. Don't collect data which is not necessary to fulfill your purposes. Do you need to collect someone's date of birth or gender, for example? Think about why you need the data before you collect it. If it's not really necessary, don't ask for it. If you have data already, delete anything you don't need or cannot justify holding. Personal data needs to be adequate, relevant, and limited to what is necessary for the purposes for which it's processed. So consider what you need at the outset and collect and retain no more than is required. Number 4, accuracy. Personal data must be accurate and where necessary kept up to date. Inaccurate data must be erased or rectified without delay. Keep the data you hold up to date and make it easy for people to contact you to update their details. Number 5, this one is also known as storage limitation. It needs to be kept in a form which permits identification of individuals for no longer than is necessary. So again, only hold data for as long as it's necessary to fulfill the purpose for which you collected it. You will need to decide the retention period for each type of data, decide what's reasonable, and then tell people what this is and why in your privacy statement. At the end of that period, you need to delete the data securely, both paper and electronic copies. Some information may be necessary for a longer period for tax or legal purposes. 7 years, for example, for invoices is common. There's further information on this on the ICO guidance to GDPR on their website. Number 6, keep data secure. This is about integrity and confidentiality. You need to keep personal data secure. This means thinking about a range of measures, from locking away paper documents containing personal data to protecting your computers and mobile devices with passwords, thinking about encryption depending on what you do with your data. Never share passwords with anybody else. Number 7, accountability. GDPR, as I've mentioned, is underpinned by a requirement that we're all accountable for demonstrating how we put the principles above into practice. Your data mapping and privacy statement are the key elements of complying with this requirement and demonstrating that you have indeed complied. Just a word about this idea of accountability. As I've said, GDPR requires us to adopt a certain turn of mind. It leaves a lot of room for personal judgment, but you absolutely must think about this stuff and document it, and make sure that you put down a writing as evidence that you're complying with transparency and accountability obligations. Try and remember this. As the ICO says, there are no hard and fast rules. So understanding the principles and then using your judgment to apply them to your own circumstances is key here. So those are the 7 data protection principles. Let's look in more detail now at the lawful bases that I mentioned earlier. Here are the 6 lawful bases, or the legal grounds, on which you can justify processing personal data. And again, you are the one who has to decide what to choose, what's right for your circumstances. Worth noting the ICO guidance, again here that's on the slide. Again, this idea of purposes, relationships and expectations is embedded here. Also here is the fact that a data controller has to make the decision about what basis to apply to each type of processing that they do. In practice, the bases which working musicians are likely to find appropriate and relevant include the following. Of course, there may be others depending on your circumstances. But contract, a key one here, you can rely on this basis to process someone's personal data where it's necessary to manage your contract with your client, e.g. sending out lesson timetables, schedules, invoices, contracts, and so on. Or if they've asked you to do something before entering into the contract, such as providing a quote. Just make sure that you don't reuse the personal data after the contract has ended or after you've given the quote for a purpose requiring an express consent, such as marketing by electronic means like email. If you're relying on contract as your basis for processing personal data, you do not need an express permission from your clients to hold their data, but you must tell them what you're doing. This information should be included in your privacy statement. Number 2, consent. Now, consent has a specific meaning in GDPR. It doesn't mean a generalized permission from someone to process their personal data or to signal agreement to a privacy statement, for example. This is sometimes a source of confusion for people getting to grips with GDPR. And I think this following comment from the ICO guidance on consent is worth bearing in mind. The ICO asks the question, do we always need consent? And their reply is, in short, no. Consent is one lawful basis for processing, but there are 5 others. Consent won't always be the most appropriate or easiest. You must always choose the lawful basis that most closely reflects the true nature of your relationship with the individual and the purpose of the processing. If consent is difficult, this is often because another lawful basis is more appropriate, so you should consider the alternatives. Okay, thank you, ICO, again. So consent under GDPR, it means offering individuals real choice and control at a detailed level. Don't bundle up different consents together, separate them all out, and don't bury consent in other terms and conditions or in the small print. Key words in all this are granular and specific and unambiguous. It must be absolutely clear what you're seeking consent for. Consent requires a positive opt-in. The individual has to do something affirmative to indicate that they've given their consent to something. You cannot rely on silence as a basis for consent. Consent also means that individuals under GDPR, individuals have an absolute right to withdraw consent at any time. It requires you to keep records showing when consent was granted, what was consented to at the time, and when consent was withdrawn. So in practice, don't offer consent if you can't offer a real choice. If, for example, you need to be able to contact people about unpaid fees, you're going to need to keep some personal data to be able to chase these payments. You don't want someone owing you money to withdraw consent from you to hold their data. You need that information. Therefore, you cannot give them a choice. In this instance, we would suggest you rely on contract as your lawful basis rather than consent. It's not likely that you will need to rely on consent very often. As I say, only offer consent if there is a genuine choice available to your data subjects. So, for example, if you're signing people up to receive a newsletter. If there's not, find another basis for processing the data. The third relevant one, or immediately relevant, is legitimate interest. This is the most flexible basis for processing data and can cover interests wider than simply your own or that of your company. It's likely to be most appropriate where you use people's data in ways that they would reasonably expect and which have a minimal privacy impact, or where there is a compelling justification for the processing. Because legitimate interest is so flexible, you have to take extra care that your legitimate interest does not override the interests and rights of the individual concerned. So make sure you've weighed up your interests in processing for a particular purpose against those of a data subject if you rely on legitimate interest. The ICO guidance on legitimate interest is detailed but useful and also tells you how to perform a simple legitimate interest test. Issues to consider under legitimate interest include the nature of your relationship with the individual. Would people expect you to use their data in the way that you're proposing? Are you happy to explain it to them, and what impact does it have on them? If you're satisfied that your legitimate interest prevails, document the purpose of the processing, your justification for relying on legitimate interest as a lawful basis, and include all this in your privacy statement. Direct marketing by non-electronic means can be considered a legitimate interest under GDPR. So if you send things by post, you don't necessarily need consent. It can be a legitimate interest. Let's talk about data mapping. You need to get to know your data and document what you do with it, and this is a requirement under GDPR. So a data map is the best way to see what you have and what you do with it. So basically you're conducting an audit of all the things that you do in relation to individuals' data. The easiest thing to do is to create a spreadsheet or something similar, to create a grid with all the headings that you see on the slide here. So 1 to 9, who are your subjects, what's the data, how do you collect data, for what purpose, and so on. Who are your data subjects? You need to list these out by group. So do you have pupils? Do you have parents of pupils? Do you have inquiries about band bookings, newsletter subscribers, and so on? Split all these out into each category and then work out what the processing is associated with each. What type of data do you collect on each category of data subject? Is it addresses, telephone numbers, bank details, photographs? Make a note of it. How do you collect it? Does it come from registration forms, contracts, websites, any other means? And why are you doing it? This is your purposes and your lawful basis. Is it to perform a contract? Is it to send out a newsletter? Is it to enter a student for an exam? So start reviewing what personal data you hold, where it came from, what you do with it, and who you share it with, and use your grid to capture this information. This document is your record of processing activities required under GDPR. ISM members can access a template data map in the members area of the ISM website. More details on that later. Your privacy statement. This falls out of your data map, really. So once you put your data map together, you're in a position to draw up this statement. It should be simple, in clear language, and you should draw attention to it wherever possible. So, for example, you can include a link to it in your email footer. You can place it on your website. If you use social media such as Facebook or Twitter, link to it there. If you have gigs and you're playing in a venue and you're collecting email addresses for your newsletter or whatever, have a paper copy of your privacy policy available. This is all part of letting people know what to expect before they hand their data over to you. Your statement should include the following things: who you are, what you're collecting, why you're collecting it, all these items here. As you can see, this information links very closely to your data map, so the one should inform the other. Do you need to get people to sign something saying they agree to your privacy statement? We get asked this quite a lot. And the answer is no. If you have a lawful basis or basis for processing, you do not need your data subjects to sign a form or write to you to tell you that they are giving you permission to hold their data or that they accept the terms of your privacy policy. You can process data lawfully without any further action on the part of your data subjects, except where you've chosen consent as your legal basis. They have to do something positive there. You're likely to need consent as your lawful basis if you want to send marketing emails electronically. In most cases, musicians can rely on lawful bases which do not require an express permission. But you do need to tell people what data you hold and why, for what purpose, and on what legal basis. So again, this is where the need for a privacy statement comes from, which contains this information and which is readily available. Your privacy statement should also include a reference to the rights individuals have as data subjects and tell them how they can have their data corrected, amended, or deleted. We look at these rights briefly next. Okay, GDPR provides the following rights for individuals. You must make reference to this in your privacy statement, as I said, and it should be provided at the time the data is collected as part of fulfilling the transparency obligation under the first data protection principle. The right to be informed. Individuals have the right to be informed about the processing of their data. This is a key transparency requirement under GDPR, and you must provide individuals with this information. Your purposes for processing, your retention periods, who it will be shared with. All of this needs to go into your privacy statement. The right of access, you may be familiar with this as under the title Subject Access Requests. Individuals have a right to access their data, which you should normally provide within 1 month from the request, free of charge in most cases. The right to rectification. This means you must amend data within a month if the individual notifies you and you agree that the data you hold is incorrect. The right to erasure. This is sometimes referred to as the right to be forgotten. This is not an absolute right, and there are circumstances when it will not apply. The ICO guidance states these in more detail. It may also not be in the interest of your business to erase data about your data subjects in some circumstances, and if you believe this to be the case, you can refuse the request, but you must have a good reason for doing so. The right to restrict processing and the right to object. Again, this is not an absolute right and can be exercised in certain circumstances. For example, when an individual has asked for personal data to be amended and you're dealing with the request, you may be asked to restrict the processing while that's going on. On the other hand, there is an absolute right to object to receiving marketing material by any means, and if you receive such a request, you must comply as quickly as you can. Other rights include the right to challenge automated decision-making and the right to data portability. These processing activities are generally carried out by organisations holding significant volumes of data and are not likely to apply in the case of music professionals. The ICO guidance does cover this in some detail. You'll notice that your data subjects can object to receiving marketing material at any time. So let's take a look at marketing and consent in a little more detail. Key message: don't send marketing by email or other electronic means, so text messages, for example, unless you have a GDPR compliant consent. I cannot emphasize this enough. This is one of the key bits of the legislation. Marketing emails drive people mad. If they don't want them, they shouldn't have to receive them. It can be very intrusive. So if you do want to market what you do and your services or your goods by electronic communications, such as email, you need to get consent from every individual you wish to communicate with in this way. In point of fact, this is not new. This is a current requirement under the existing privacy and electronic communications regulations. Just so you know, these are expected to be developed by new legislation next year. Marketing email is one of the key targets of GDPR. Unwanted, intrusive, burdensome, inappropriate, just some of the words that are used about this sort of communication. Remember that GDPR is about giving choice to data subjects in certain areas, and this is a key one. What does GDPR compliant mean? Well, it means that a consent is clearly given by an affirmative action of some kind by the individual concerned. It's unambiguous and specific, and that you can also demonstrate how and when you obtain the consent. This can be a challenge, which is why you should only use consent if it's really, really necessary. What is affirmative action? Tick boxes are a good example of an affirmative action. Do note that under GDPR, pre-ticked boxes are banned. You have to leave them blank so people can make a genuine choice. But there may be other actions that satisfy the requirements of an affirmative action. So adding your name to a list which draws attention to your privacy policy and also states what the purpose of the list is, i.e. to sign up to a newsletter, that can be an affirmative action for the purposes of the law. Managing newsletters and subscription lists and the like through electronic services such as SurveyMonkey or MailChimp can be a good way of proving how and when you obtained a consent, because the systems record these events for you and you can export them from the system if ever you're challenged to show that you had a consent from somebody. But you need to make sure that you have consents before you send any email marketing, and you need to make sure that you include an unsubscribe option with every email that you do send. Non-email marketing, by post for example, may be permissible under legitimate interest, as we discussed. If you rely on consent, keep records of anyone who has given the consent and when, and anyone who has objected to receiving marketing information by whatever means. The Information Commission there. Do you need to register with the ICO? Well, in point of fact, from the 25th of May, new regulations mean that you don't have to register, but data controllers have to pay a fee unless they are exempt. The best way to ascertain if you're required to pay the fee is to undertake the online self-assessment, and the website page address for the ICO is there on the slide. In many cases, you're going to need to pay the fee, which is currently £40 at the lowest level. The fee may depend on turnover of the individual or company. The ICO has a range of investigative and corrective authorization advisory powers to address infringements of data protection laws. It can impose fines, and they can be significant. The ICO has said, however, that it's taking a pragmatic approach and recognises that many more people are having to address data protection issues properly for the first time. So their approach is carrot rather than stick. So we're not going to spend too much time on the fines that can be levied here. You can read about those in the GDPR guidance. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't now prepare a data map and a privacy statement. And even if you are exempt from paying the fee, you should still prepare a data map and a privacy statement. You still have to comply with the law, even if you're not required to pay the fee. So, we're almost at the end of this presentation, but I want to cover what you should do now to ensure compliance with the GDPR now it's law. If you haven't already, you should audit your data and prepare your data map. Make sure this includes your lawful basis for processing personal data. Write your privacy statement and make it easily and widely accessible. Check your consents are GDPR compliant if you rely on consent. And don't send email marketing to people unless you're absolutely sure you have a proper consent. The ICO data controller fee, check whether you need to pay it. Call the ICO for advice if necessary. You'll find their telephone number on the website. You need to keep up to date. This is new law and things will be changing. The ICO is committed to updating its information all the time as the law settles in, so check regularly. If you're an ISM member, you can find lots of information as well as a template data map and a privacy statement on our website in the members area. We will be updating our GDPR resources regularly. The ICO has also produced a 12-step checklist, which is useful, and I think it covers all the points that we've spoken about. That's the end of the presentation, but we're now open for questions if you have any. Thank you very much. And we are open. Okay, I have a question here from Helen. Helen, thank you very much for getting in touch with us. This question is as follows. I'm a self-employed piano teacher working from home. My new pupils sign an ISM agreement when they start lessons with me, and I keep a paper copy of each one. I also keep a paper copy of the examination board feedback sheet whenever a pupil takes an exam. I keep pupils' contact details on my computer. Do I need to take any GDPR action? Should I put a privacy statement on my website? And if so, what should it state? Thank you. This is a really interesting question, and there are several parts to the answers. So let's start with the first one. First question is, okay, are you processing data for the purposes of GDPR and legislation? And I think the answer is yes. You're keeping records on a computer which identifies real people. You're processing it, so you're adding stuff, you may change it, you're keeping notes. If there's any billing associated, you don't mention that, but you may do. So some sort of GDPR action will be necessary because you are processing your data. So the second part then is, well, what action do you need to take? So we go back to what we looked at earlier. You need to audit your data and map it. So what do you collect, why, what are your purposes, all those things. What's your lawful basis, identify it. Out of that, you then need to do your privacy statement. And all the things that we said. You may need to pay a fee to the data, the Information Commissioner's Office, do the self-assessment to find out whether you're exempt. I suspect you won't be, but the ICO will give you the definitive answer to that. Thank you, a very interesting question. All right. Great, we have a couple more, thank you very much. So here's a question from Mark. Thank you, Mark. As a group of musicians performing at weddings, we take pictures and videos during these events to use on our Facebook page. How does GDPR apply to this scenario? Okay, we have to go back to some key principles which about what is personal data. If people are identifiable from the photos that you take, it could be considered to be personal data. Now, it's context dependent really. So, for example, if you put it on your Facebook page and you say, we are at a wedding of somebody else, and you link them to the Facebook page, it may be that other people could identify people from those photos. So you need to think carefully about whether or not you need to get some sort of general permission for taking photos. It's good practice anyway, quite separate from data protection legislation, or whether you can deal with it by another means, such as avoiding faces of people who are not the people who are holding the wedding, for example, angling things so that things are not, people's faces are not in view, all these sorts of things. It will depend on the context, but yes, start from the point of view, it's personal data, therefore GDPR will apply. You need to be careful, you need to probably try and get some sort of permissions from people. All right, thank you. We have another question here, which is as follows. I think it's more of a comment, really, from Kath. Thank you, Kath. I paid the ICO fee. It's frustrating that there's no definitive guidance on whether this is necessary for what must be thousands of music teachers. Well, indeed, I agree with you, and I think many of our members have tried to do the self-assessment test. They've been through all the hoops and jumps and come out with an ambiguous answer or it's not clear. But I think the answer that I had from the ICO when I spoke with them was that in many cases, if people are processing, using computers, basically storing data, collecting it, holding it, processing it in any of the modern ways, then they're likely to be a data controller for the purposes of the legislation, and as such the fee is due. It is clear that many, many more people will be swept up into this whole business of notifying ICO that they are a data controller. And what GDPR does is make it more of an obligation on the ICO to enforce all of this. So I think all we can do is to keep nagging the ICO for better guidance, for more explicit guidance, as these things evolve. They're still changing their advice. In some areas, there was new material up only in the last couple of weeks. So May the 25th of May, in their words, is not the end of the story, but very much the beginning. So I appreciate your frustration, and I think we just need to keep on at the ICO. And thanks for your comment. It is frustrating, but better safe than sorry. All right. Are there any more questions? Very happy to take some. We've got a couple more minutes. If there aren't any more questions, I would just like to say thank you to all of you who have joined the webinar today. If you want to revisit it, it will be on the website soon, so you can play it back. If you're an ISM member, as I say, we have resources available to you in the member section of our website, including a template data map, a template privacy statement, and some detailed guidance on all of the stuff which covers some of the ground we've covered today. If you're interested in things like privacy statements, it's also worth looking at privacy statements of existing companies. So, for example, you can go and have a look at the ISM's own privacy policy, which you'll find on our website under privacy policy. It's very interesting to see how people apply the provisions of the GDPR and turn it into a statement. So there's no fixed way of doing it. If you're an ISM member, we've sort of cut through some of the uncertainty and put together a guide for you that will help you put your statement together. All right, I think that's it. Once again, thank you very much indeed for listening, and I will be signing off here, and I hope that you'll join us when we update our GDPR information again in the future. Many thanks and have a great afternoon.